The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMZ.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Humanity First. My name is Peter Evers, your host of the show, and we're going to be talking about something very topical today. The Trump administration is somewhat 60 days in, and I suppose the best way to think about how the last 60 days has been is somewhat chaotic. This is, by their very nature and own explanation, a transformational government. And there have been a lot of activities. We're going to talk about those activities in terms of the executive orders that have been passed, also many of the injunctions against those executive orders, and talk a little bit about what that means to you. What does tariffs mean in terms of affecting your pocket? What does the struggles with other governments mean to the people of America? And did those people who voted for this administration, how do they feel? Do they feel as though they're getting what they wanted, or do they feel as if they're on the other end of this in terms of inflation and how far are we away from $20 dozen eggs? Stick around. We'll be back in a minute.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMZ, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMZ because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamzjobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMZ.
Hi, welcome back, everybody. This is Peter Evers from Humanity First. And as promised, we have a lively discussion coming up, and we have two old pros from Humanity First. We have Dean Spiliotes, political scientist from Southern New Hampshire University, and pro of many radio and television shows up in New Hampshire, and now, of course, down here. Hi, Dean. How are you doing?
Hi, Peter. I'm doing well, thanks.
Good. And Chris Ryan is with us again, another regular on the show, and the host of New Hampshire Now, which you can catch in the mornings in New Hampshire. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Phenomenal. Yourself?
I'm very good. We're about 2 months into the Trump administration, and as promised, it has been chaotic and a whirlwind, and depending on which side of the political fence you're on, I'm sure it's been magnificent or absolutely terrifying. One thing that we're getting is a news cycle 24/7 on the Trump administration and all of the intrigue that goes with it. But today, I'd really like to talk about what does this mean for Americans? And, you know, I was mentioning at the top of the show, there are many people who voted for this administration who might be actually questioning why they voted at the moment. Steve Bannon actually said the other day that this whole Medicaid piece that I want to talk about, the $880 million cut, 1 in 5 of Trump's base have Medicaid, whether they know it or not. And what does that mean when insulin prices are going to go up to $600 a pop or whatever to those folks? But there's other things I'd like to talk about, and that is things like, is there a connection between the adjustment in the stock market and what's been going on at the moment? What is the effect of all of these, of this sort of shock and awe executive orders, and where do they go? And what are the courts going to do about that? And generally speaking, what is going to happen to the American public, and how are they going to be affected by this or not? Because I think the political machinations and legal machinations of this are going to have an impact on what actually shakes out. So there's a lot to talk about. So maybe, Dean, if we could start with you. Are you surprised in the first 60 days, or is this sort of par for the course in terms of what you get from this administration?
I wouldn't say that I'm surprised. Kind of gaming it all out to see where we're going to be headed in the next 6 months to a year is maybe a little bit more challenging than I might initially have thought. Everything that President Trump is doing now are things that he talked about in the election, in the election campaign. Maybe not exactly the outcomes he discussed. He did talk about lowering prices and improving the economy on day one in his presidency. He also said that the way to do that will be through tariffs, and he has kept his word with that. I think the biggest issue for people is it's created a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the markets, in the grocery store, in the housing, everything, employment, and I think that people don't like uncertainty, markets don't like uncertainty, businesses don't like uncertainty for planning and inventory and manufacturing purposes. So I think that this kind of whiplash quality to some of the decision making, even though the sort of the broad strokes of what we're seeing are what he promised, kind of the whiplash nature, the kind of reactive nature of some of his decision making, combined with the level of uncertainty, even if you're not in the market, and many Americans, I think upwards of 40 or 50% are not in the stock market. But for many, at a minimum, their retirements are, even if they're not active investors. I think that all of that has fed into this sort of consumer pessimism and uncertainty about the future. If you're not sure if you're going to lose your job, if you're not sure if you're going to be able to afford a house or a car, or even groceries for that matter, it really changes everything.
Yeah, interesting though, because those three things you talked about are the last 4 years, right? Of people have been saying, I can't get on the ladder, inflation prices are out of control. So in some ways, you could argue that that's sort of a little bit more of the same with a different
Well,
administration.
and that's Trump's. I mean, that's Trump's mode of operating, saying only I can fix it. I will fix it on day one, and you will never have seen anything like it before.
Yeah.
I think there's some truth to that, but maybe not exactly in the way that he meant it.
Yeah, I mean, people. Somebody was talking about the $20 egg sort of point. Somebody once said to me that they would quit drinking when beer got to $100 a pint. We're a little bit short of that, but Chris, what interests me is the way that American government is structured. So you can have a transformational government coming in here who want to do all these things, but there are mechanisms that sort of slow that down a little bit. For those people who are annoyed that those things have been slowed down, and those people who are glad about that, are the arms of government here working in terms of the courts, in terms of the way that some people can push back against some of these things? Is this normal? Are we going to get sort of entrenched in our different sides, and we'll get stuck again?
Yes, I think, is the government working? Congress has not worked for some time, and that's created a lot of the environment we find ourselves in right now. The courts are being tested, and that's where the last kind of line of defense is right now in regard to if you don't like what Trump is doing, or if you feel what Trump is doing is illegal, you sue, whether you're a state, a city, an organization. You sue to test the legality of that. And we've seen varying success when it comes to executive orders. One of the main ones was with birthright citizenship, and that was held up almost instantly. And there have been other areas where courts have held things back. To the overall point of what is the effect of this administration on individuals, I guess it kind of comes down to who you are as an individual. And that was really the case up until the last few weeks. The last few weeks, it's changed in that everyone is being affected by the stock market sell-off and the uncertainty, and the confusion about where things are headed. So, the person that voted for Trump was expecting chaos. Even the person that didn't vote for Trump was expecting there to be resolute action. But they expected perhaps different results when it came to the economy. Even folks that are not huge supporters of Trump or don't like his personality or his style, they think that Trump is good for the economy because he is seen as being pro-business. And that in itself would lead to economic gains, prosperity, and the stock market continuing to move in a positive direction. However, what the stock market does not like is uncertainty, fluctuation and a lack of clear direction about why things are being done and what the outcomes are going to be. So that's why the tariffs, in my view, have created this uncertainty within the markets. The sell-off has largely been driven by folks that are starting to be worried and concerned. And I know I've heard from a number of individuals about pushing back their retirements, of taking all their money out of the stock market, which I don't recommend.
No.
But people have done that. They've taken all their money out for fear that they're going to continue to see the losses pile up. So for those folks that voted for Trump based upon the pure rationale of, yes, I don't necessarily like a lot of the things, I don't agree with a lot of the things about him, but I feel that this is the best economic decision for me and my family, those folks are now the ones that are most upset.
Yeah, Dean, can I pick up on that a minute? Because I was struck by, we are now in a period of, I was having a conversation over lunch with this halcyon day when, Tip O'Neill would do a deal with Reagan, or, even 20 years ago when there were these, relationships that existed in the House and the Senate that actually got things done. But really, you could argue that we're in a culture war at the moment, that decisions that are being made aren't about fixing streetlights and they aren't about the person in the street. So you get these two groups of people, the blue folks who really believe in one thing, and the red folks who believe in something that is polar opposite. And yet we're all going to be struggling at the end of the day with some of these decisions. I wonder, Dean, if this is the result of having politics so polemic and having them all based on philosophies rather than economics, because I don't see any of the decisions from either of the sides. We got the Democrats spending an awful lot of time defending trans rights, which I think is the right thing. You get the Republicans spending all this time like saying that trans people are destroying our culture, and yet this is happening. How do the American people make sense of that when they're looking at the dollar in their pocket?
Yeah, and I think to some extent there's always been some of this in our politics. In the modern case, certainly going back to the beginning of the Reagan administration, we had this sort of increasing the rise of conservative think tanks and culture, the kind of cultural arguments that you're talking about have become increasingly central to our politics. We're now at a point, though, and I think a lot of it has been, Chris and I have talked about this many times, a lot of it has been augmented by digital technology, social media, ease of communication, which has kind of an echo chamber, a magnifying effect on all of it. Yeah. And I think what you see is, bipartisanship now is not something you get credit for. It's almost a dirty word. You saw Biden spend the first 2 years of administration accomplishing some pretty significant bipartisan legislation, some of which Trump has now said he's going to reverse, much of which he doesn't really get any credit for a variety of reasons. It's now really about tending to your base, tending towards the central elements of your party. And it really, as you suggested, it really is about identity. And I think one of the reasons why you see this sort of enduring split is because each side is essentially at a point now, for this basis of culture and identity and these sorts of arguments, is at a point where they essentially say, no matter how bad my guy is, I could never possibly vote for the other person. You can't, in your core identity, as you increasingly self-select where you go online, the neighborhoods you live in, where you send your kids to school, what kinds of churches you go to if you worship at all, et cetera, et cetera. It's all been magnified in this current environment. And just a real quick, one final thing back on the earlier comments by Chris and your question about is government working. It is true that the courts, as Chris said, are the last line of defense. We just saw a federal judge in San Francisco today order the Office of Policy Management, OPM, to personnel management, to order them to reinstate thousands of federal workers. They're going to appeal. So the issue is, this is happening with such speed, but the court process is much slower. So stuff may work its way to the Supreme Court eventually, but it could be a year or two. And by then, the damage is essentially done. So yes, I think the courts provide a good final defense on kind of the overextension of executive power, but the timing is just so different that makes it a little bit problematic with all these sorts of court decisions about personnel management.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting, isn't it? Because, I was thinking the other day about traditional Republicans. Traditionally, Americans have always had a hard spot for the former Soviet Union, right? And it's always been we've identified the enemy, when the Iron Curtain went up, and subsequently about the red risk, if you like. And yet, we have a Republican government right now who is aligning pretty strongly with Russia. And then you think about that and you think, well, what are America's best interests? Because Russia is aligning with China. So, there are all of these things that are sort of zooming around and making us think differently about where our allegiances lie, even on a global basis. And yet, the person on the street is thinking, where does this leave me? Which leads me to the next question, is that when we come up to midterms, because everybody has an eye on the midterms, and when these Republicans in not particularly safe seats go back to their constituencies and hear backlash, is that another thing that will tend to draw us back to the median here in terms of the outrage or the very, very extreme things that this government is proposing? Is that a natural governor of behaviors across all political parties?
We're not going back to the medium anytime soon. If we're being honest, there's too much invested interests, in there being this contention between the two parties, and whether it's from a media standpoint, guilty, or from a political fundraising standpoint, it is incredibly important for there to be opposition, tension, and all those things. For being honest, Republican and Democrats in Congress agree on a heck of a lot more than they disagree on. But we focus on, the aspects of which there is disagreement. And Trump and Democrats have been largely successful at fundraising off of the other side being, as Dean mentioned, much worse than you. You don't have to be better. You just have to be not as bad as the opposition. And that also explains, the enemy dynamic and how that's shifted, where our enemies used to be, foreign enemies. There was a poll a number of years ago that showed that Putin had better approval numbers in the Republican Party than Nancy Pelosi did. Then I knew we were in a lot of trouble, because elections went from being an inter-squad scrimmage where at the end of the day everybody was on the same team, and there was there were things to be done after the game was over because your scrimmage and practice had come to a close. The election now, like the election is the game, and it's all that matters. The governing piece is very much secondary to this kind of perpetual election cycle, and us kind of moving on to the midterm elections. And yeah, it's all happening. Jeanne Shaheen up here in New Hampshire announced she was not running again. Democrats are not in a good position from the U.S. Senate standpoint. Pete Buttigieg announced today that he is not running for governor or the U.S. Senate, and will probably run, in my view, for president in 2028. So Democrats are in a spot now where, do they play the card of, hey, just kind of like Trump, the Republicans did the last time, where we just don't have to, as long as we're viewed as being somewhat better than the other side, we can be viewed negatively. But as long as we're viewed as being the alternative when there's a binary choice, we'll have success in the midterms, and we'll just kind of sit in the backdrop. And as James Carville said, play dead and just like be there. And when election time comes around, we'll just go and win. Like, I've long said like that Biden won basically because he was like a potted plant. He was just kind of there, and he was not Trump. It went back in, 2020. So I don't assume Democratic success in the midterm elections because it comes down to candidates. And you look particularly at the U.S. Senate. I'm interested in Dean's take on this because we haven't talked about it yet. But I'm not making any guarantees about, Democrats taking over, the Senate once again, because candidate quality is important, messaging is important, and we haven't seen enough. Now, if the economy continues the way that it's going, yeah, I mean, those Democrats are in a good position to be less worse than the Republicans, and yeah, but I'm not going to say that right now Democrats are automatically going to retake the Senate. The House looks perhaps a little bit better.
Yeah, Dean, we're running out of time, of course,
Sure.
as usual, but I'd love to hear your take on that. I have never really thought that the idea of saying less because the other side is going to implode, like James Carville said, is really much of an ethos or philosophy politically. Surely that can't win.
Well, and then regardless, though, even if it is a potential strategy, there will be enough agitation from activists in the Democratic base to not do that. That they'll see that as a sign of weakness. You've seen pretty withering criticism of Democratic leadership in Congress from the Democratic base for not doing enough quickly enough. So the idea of just kind of letting it happen, I think, operationally is not an option for the Democrats. In terms of the midterms, I don't, I don't have an expectation that Democrats will flip the Senate. Maybe they'll pick up a seat or narrow the margin, but and as for New Hampshire, my sense is that the seat leans Democratic, with the exception of if Chris Sununu gets into the race, then that'll be quite a marquee toss-up.
Yeah.
But if it's Pappas against anyone else, there's no guarantee, but they'll probably hold the seat. I mean, the House is more, as Chris said, is more likely to flip, and part of that is just because House elections taken in the aggregate tend to be more reflective of general shifts in unhappiness,
Right.
partisanship. It's the first midterm of a new president's technically new president's administration. They typically lose seats at the midterm. Democrats will be motivated to turn out. So if anything's going to happen, I think maybe the Democrats will flip the House. Senate, it's just not a great map. It's not a great map for Democrats this time around.
No. Which, is interesting. And so as we finish, I think what we're talking about is that there's more chaos and there's more jockeying and there's more, the tactics need to be really honed from the opposition in order to fight this. But we're blessed with being living in interesting times, and these are probably more interesting than anything over the last 10 or 15 years. So thank you so much for your insights, and hopefully we can come back in another maybe 3 months and see where we're at in terms of how this administration is progressing and how the opposition are beginning to form some sort of credible defense. I really appreciate it, both of you. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thanks, Peter.
Thank
Thank you.